Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for November 22nd, 2022. Let's begin by talking about what happened at the COP27 conference, also known as FLOP27. Forget the spin in the press about the progress made at the conference in Cairo. This is a hoax. It was a flop. The nations of the global south, reinforced by the BRICS and other emerging anti-colonial institutions, did not bow down before the green imperial powers that insisted they adopt policies that would reduce the potential for these nations to have economic development. They did not accept the fake science. Instead, they asserted their sovereignty and the rights they have to develop their national economies to meet the needs of their citizens. This means rejecting the demands that they give up the use of coal and fossil fuels for energy. And this was a major defeat for those who are using climate as a justification for imposing policies to depopulate the globe. Now, it's clear from the whining of the chair of the COP26 conference last year in Glasgow, the British Tory Member of Parliament Alok Sharma, who moaned, and listen to his words, "Where is the clear follow-through on the phase-down of coal? Not in this text. Clear commitment to phase out all fossil fuels? Not in this text." Remember, this is the same Sharma who cried at the end of COP26 because he said all the goals were not met last year. Now, the media is saying that this is largely due to the power of big oil. That's nonsense. The oil-producing countries did oppose the attempt to reduce fossil fuels, led by the Saudis and other OPEC members. But so did the nations of the global south. Instead, they are insisting that they have a right to the technologies they need, including more efficient energy production, as opposed to solar panels and windmills. They're fighting for clean coal. They're fighting for fossil fuels, liquefied natural gas, nuclear power. They don't want to go back to the Stone Age, which is what they're trying to emerge from. Now, they also insisted that there be a fund set up to help them with damages which are supposedly the result of climate change. For example, flooding. Well, that's a good insistence. That's for building infrastructure. Needless to say, the Western powers rejected this initially. London, the United States, and Brussels opposed it. But in the end, the US caved in. This was included in the final communique, even though it's highly unlikely that the rich countries will come up with the funds that they promised, as they face high inflation, they face suffocating debt, escalating costs for the war in Ukraine, and their own collapsing infrastructure. Now, there are two comments that epitomize the rebellion against the imperial green agenda. One is from Uganda's President Museveni, who, by the way, is on the Ukrainian Committee to Counter Disinformation, which is the Nazi hit list. Museveni is on that hit list. Well, here's what he said, quote, "It is morally bankrupt for Europeans to take Africa's fossil fuels for their own energy production, but refuse to countenance African use of those same fuels for their own energy production," unquote. The second comment is from an anonymous African source who said, "They drink wine, they tell us to drink water." And that source could have added, "and we don't have adequate clean water because of the continuation of colonial policies." The further evidence of the disappointment from the oligarchy was the Atlantic Council having a conference to wrap up what was the conclusion of the COP27. And the title of this was, "The Global South Won, but Did the Climate?" And one official said this was a, quote, "utter failure," unquote. Well, all that's left is for them to blame Putin. And in a sense, Putin is responsible because Putin is part of the BRICS and part of the emergence of a new strategic and economic geometry which is opposed to giving up sovereignty and submitting to the great powers. While this is going on, there's a growing awareness in Europe of the need to openly oppose the policies of the Western leaders that are taking their talking points from the City of London. One example of this I gave you yesterday is from the London Economist magazine, which put out the marching orders. No negotiation to end the war in Ukraine. You have to fight until Russia is defeated. And this is the line that's coming out still from NATO after the near miss of a potential nuclear war from the Ukrainian missile which hit Poland and which the Ukrainians tried to blame on Russia. On November 24th, there will be motorcades in 18 German cities, sponsored by something called the Entrepreneur Revolt. This is going to eventually join up with the farmers, with the taxi drivers, with the shipyard workers, the rail strikers, and others to become a large movement. But what's the issues that the German protest will be addressing? 1, end the Ukraine war. 2, fight inflation. And 3, end the policies which produce food and fuel shortages, such as the Green New Deal and sanctions. Today, November 22nd, the Schiller Institute will have a conference under the title Stop the Danger of Nuclear War. It will be on the Schiller Institute website starting at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time, 3:30 p.m. Central Europe Time. If you're listening to this after that, you can always go and pick it up on the schillerinstitute.com website. This is a conference which will include elected officials, former elected officials, who will be talking about what it will take to build a new strategic and financial architecture to break away from the power of the City of London and Wall Street and Brussels and NATO and their intention to impose a new Green Deal for the world and do this, back it up by the military force of the United States and NATO. Now, finally, a note of solemn remembrance of what happened 59 years ago today, the murder of John F. Kennedy, which was immediately covered up and is still officially blamed on a lone assassin, Lee Harvey Oswald. What was it that Kennedy was doing when he was taken away from us? He was demonstrating leadership in 2 areas sadly lacking leadership today: to establish a fair and just strategic architecture and a financial architecture which favored physical economic goods production based on implementation and applying scientific and technological progress to the production of goods. These are areas where Kennedy changed course during his administration and provided leadership in 2 what could have been deadly crises at the time. First, the Cuban Missile Crisis, where he resolved the potential danger of nuclear war through his standing up against the war hawks in his own cabinet. And there were intense fights, a push for an invasion of Cuba, bombing the missile sites and so on, coming from the military and civilian leadership. And he stood up against that. But he did it because he recognized the legitimate security concerns of the Soviet Union. This is something which is not talked about very often. Usually they say Kennedy was courageous because he was willing to go to nuclear war. No, that's not what shows courage. If necessary, he was prepared to push to that point, but to step away from it was based on recognizing that as he was facing pressure from his war hawks to do something about Russian Soviet missiles in Cuba, Khrushchev was under pressure from his government, his group of leaders, over U.S. missiles placed in Turkey as well as NATO in Europe. And the decision to move away from nuclear confrontation based on recognizing the legitimate security concerns of others, that should have been done going back to 2008, 2014, 2022 in dealing with the situation that Putin was describing for Russia, where he said, as Kennedy did, it's intolerable to have weapons of mass destruction deployed on the borders of our nation. Now, Kennedy not only made that arrangement with Khrushchev, the deal with Khrushchev, but he began moving toward détente and was questioning the U.S. policy of preparing for war in Vietnam. Secondly, in dealing with the economic crisis, in June 1963, he issued an executive order, Executive Order 11110, to circumvent the Federal Reserve by circulating U.S. Treasury notes to fund economic development to deal with the problem of a lack of credit going into industry and production. Same problem we have today. Now, in both of these issues, he went against what Eisenhower had described on his way out the door as the special interests of the military-industrial complex. And it's relatively certain that Eisenhower discussed this with Kennedy in the meeting they had before Kennedy was inaugurated. That military-industrial complex still exists today. It's expanded to all the corporate cartels, to the think tanks, the academic community, the media, and so on. And it's probably more dangerous today than it was in 1963. So as we remember today the courage of John F. Kennedy as he moved in this direction, let us not simply mourn the loss of the opportunity that his courage represented and what was taken away from us by his murder. Let us instead pledge that we will take up the torch that he carried to fulfill the mission that he adopted, to end the danger of nuclear war and to overcome and end the colonial policies which benefited the cartels at the expense of much of the world's population. That's my report for today. I'll see you again tomorrow. And remember, go to the schillerinstitute.com today to see the conference on Stop the Danger of Nuclear War.